Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Wednesday, 15 October 2025. It is the 99th anniversary of the birth of Paul Michel Foucault, better known to posterity as Michel Foucault, who was born in Poitiers on this date in 1926. In yesterday's episode, I talked about Eric Kahler, who is a comparatively obscure figure and someone whose thought isn't well known, poses certain problems of exposition. With Foucault, we have the opposite problem. Foucault has become a name to conjure with. He is about as famous as a philosopher can get, making him one of the rock stars of philosophy to whom I referred yesterday. Foucault has, as a consequence, been enormously influential, and there's a library of exposition and commentary devoted to his work, so I'm not going to try to give a survey of Foucault's work, much less a survey of the scholarship on his work, but only to say a few things about his view of history. And I'm going to ignore the political controversies that still swirl around Foucault decades after his death, except to quote an interview from 1983. Quote, "There have been Marxists who said I was a danger to Western democracy. There was a socialist thinker who wrote that the thinker who resembled me most closely was Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf. I have been considered by liberals as a technocrat, an agent of the Gaullist government. I have been considered by people on the right, Gaullists or otherwise, as a dangerous left-wing anarchist. And there was an American professor who asked why a crypto-Marxist like me, manifestly a KGB agent, was invited to American universities, and so on." Unquote. This political elusiveness also comes out clearly in Foucault's conversations with Duccio Trombadori, who was a Marxist, and these interviews are published in a book called Remarks on Marx, which is well worth reading. In my episode on Fernand Braudel, I pointed out how unusual it was for anyone in the French intellectual scene in the second half of the 20th century not to be a Marxist. And this was true of Foucault as well. Although Foucault wasn't a Marxist, he certainly was profoundly influenced by Marx. But there were a lot of other influences as well. Nietzsche, Freud, Husserl and phenomenology, Heidegger and existentialism, the structuralist backlash against phenomenology, hermeneutics, and all the familiar influences on 20th century French thought. Foucault said in 1983, quote, "I belong to that generation who, as students, had before their eyes and were limited by a horizon consisting of Marxism, phenomenology, and existentialism." Unquote. Foucault was able to overcome this limitation in his own work, drawing from all of them but not being limited by any one of them, or all of them for that matter. Foucault's political ambiguity extended to his philosophical commitments also. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who was a philosopher before he turned to anthropology, amusingly called Foucault an anti-humanist human scientist. You can get a sense of Foucault's attitude to humanism from a 1971 interview in which he said, quote, "Humanism invented a whole series of subjected sovereignty, the soul, ruling the body but subjected to God, consciousness, sovereign in the context of judgment but subjected to the necessities of truth, the individual, a titular control of personal rights subjected to the laws of nature and society, basic freedom, sovereign within but accepting the demands of an outside world and aligned with destiny. In short, humanism is everything in Western civilization that restricts the desire for power. It prohibits the desire for power and excludes the possibility of power being seized." Unquote. Humanism was traditionally a kind of honorific, but Foucault turns it into an accusation. This rejection of humanism as an ideology didn't, however, prevent him from spending most of his time studying the human sciences, which are almost unthinkable apart from humanism. I could even say that this unthinkability of the human sciences apart from humanism is a central thesis of Foucault's thought. So he positions himself as though he were a pathologist studying a fascinating disease. As though to underline this, he says in one place, quote, historical sense has more in common with medicine than philosophy, unquote. One scholar has characterized Foucault's method as sweeping generalization combined with eccentric detail. The mention of eccentric detail is a nod to one of the distinctive features of his method, which was to immerse himself in the specialist literature of a period, usually a period he called the Classical Age, which is more or less coextensive with the modern period, although probably a little narrower, because he sometimes refers to it as starting in the middle of the 17th century and going up through the end of the 19th century. Foucault said in an interview, quote, for the birth of the clinic, I read every medical work of importance for methodology of the period 1780 to 1820. The choices that one should make are inadmissible and shouldn't exist. One ought to read everything, study everything. In other words, one must have at one's disposal the general archive of a period at a given moment. And archaeology is, in a strict sense, the science of this archive, unquote. Given what he says about his research for the birth of the clinic, one could say that Foucault's method was closer to that of the historian than the philosopher. Foucault had studied under Jean Hippolyte, and the historical bent of his thought has been credited to Hippolyte's influence. And Hippolyte was a famous French Hegelian, to which I devoted an episode last year. Foucault's method was pervasively historical, but the historical method wasn't really about understanding history itself, but rather about understanding human beings and human thought throughout their history. Foucault named his own chair at the Collège de France, History of the Systems of Thought. This gives you a sense of how history is a means to an end for Foucault, whether that end is the elucidation of systems of thought or the critique of the human sciences. The series of books that made Foucault famous were close studies of particular institutions, historical institutions, I should say, that embodied the the human sciences. These books started with Madness and Civilization, also published as The History of Madness, in 1961, which recounted what Foucault called the Great Confinement, which marked the inception of lunatic asylums to segregate the mentally ill from wider society, which Foucault used as an opportunity to examine the relationship between reason and insanity. The Birth of the Clinic, an archaeology of medical perception, appeared in 1963. Discipline and Punish, the Birth of the Prison, appeared in 1970. Between The Birth of the Clinic and Discipline and Punish were his two methodological works, The Order of Things, an Archaeology of the Human Sciences in 1966, and The Archaeology of Knowledge, published in 1969. These books that made Foucault's reputation are written in an elliptic, even a cryptic style. I'm never sure if I understand what Foucault was saying, or if indeed he had any one particular meaning in mind. So it was a surprise to me when his lectures at the Collège de France began to be published and translated into English posthumously, since these are relatively clear and straightforward compared to the books he published while he was alive. These later lectures are probably a lot easier way to get into Foucault's thought than the earlier books, and if I were teaching Foucault, I would start there. But it was the earlier books that made a real splash on the intellectual scene. The concepts Foucault investigated, such as clinics, prisons, and madhouses, were intrinsically historical institutions that nevertheless often denied their historicity, as though these institutions were the earthly representation of Platonic forms, the moving images of the eternal clinic, the eternal prison, and the eternal madhouse, as it were. Foucault relentlessly attacks these Platonic presuppositions, but always in consciously opaque language that reminds me of Mannerist painting. To give a sense of how he does this, here's a bit from his The Birth of the Clinic that gives some idea of his approach to history. Quote, "For reasons that are bound up with the history of modern man, the clinic was to remain, in the opinion of most thinkers, more closely related to the themes of light and liberty, which in fact had evaded it, than to the discursive structure in which in fact it originated. It is often thought that the clinic originated in that free garden where, by common consent, doctor and patient met, where observation took place, innocent of theories, by the unaided brightness of the gaze, where, from master to disciple, experience was transmitted beneath the level of words, and to the advantage of a historical view that relates the fecundity of the clinic to a scientific, political, and economic liberalism. One forgets that for years it was the ideological theme that prevented the organization of clinical medicine." Unquote. Mostly Foucault didn't characterize his own work as history, but rather he called it genealogy or archaeology. The use of genealogy shows the influence of Nietzsche, as Nietzsche had written a work called On the Genealogy of Morals. It was published in 1887. This is my favorite book by Nietzsche, and it's in a sense, I consider it a kind of culmination of Nietzsche's essentially naturalistic conception of moral ideas and how they evolved. In many of his earlier works, Nietzsche had incorporated some of his ideas on the origins of morality, and it's in his On the Genealogy of Morals that this project is made explicit, and he made a harvest of his previously unsystematic remark on ethics and the origins of ethical ideas. Foucault took up this Nietzschean conception of genealogy and he ran with it. He wrote, quote, "Genealogy is gray, meticulous, and patiently documentary. It operates on a field of entangled and confused parchments, on documents that have been scratched over and recopied many times." Unquote. And he offers some hints about how genealogy differs from history, but as always, never framed explicitly, but suggested by the context and the tone of his remarks. For example, quote, "Genealogy does not oppose itself to history as the lofty and profound gaze of the philosopher might compare to the mole-like perspective of the scholar. On the contrary, it rejects the metahistorical deployment of ideal significations and indefinite teleologies. It opposes itself to the search for origins." Unquote. From a passage like this, we can gather what Foucault saw as the kind of history he wasn't doing and didn't want to do. Foucault's genealogy rejects origins, ideals, and teleology alike. We can imagine the Foucauldian genealogist dipping into the historical continuum, tracing some development for a time, and then surfacing again without having identified a beginning or an end, an archetype or an ideal. I don't think we'd be far wrong if we said that Foucault's genealogies are the continental equivalent of the Cambridge School of Contextualism, which I discussed in my episode on J.G.A. Pocock. And if we do look at it this way, we can see that both continental and Anglo-American scholars were, at about the same time, attempting a closer and more careful reading of how the concepts that we take for granted today, our system of thought, or what Foucault also called our épistèmé, came into being. If we wanted to belittle this approach, we could call it a just so story of our épistèmé. But since Foucault had forsworn origins and teleologies, it's not difficult to imagine how he would have responded to this. Foucault's genealogies and archaeologies were focused on the human sciences. In the order of things, he singles out linguistics, taxonomy and natural history, and economics. But interestingly, he doesn't explicitly name history as a human science, though it seems like it would naturally fall under this heading. But after long sections of the book on his three chosen human sciences, he turns to anthropology. Anthropology is the paradigm of a human science. It's the human science. And his exposition of anthropology is both historical and implicitly bound up with a conception of history. Foucault writes, quote, man's mode of being as constituted in modern thought enables him to play two roles. He is at the same time the foundation of all positivities and present in a way that cannot even be termed privileged in the element of empirical things. This fact, it is not a matter here of man's essence in general, but simply of that historical a priori which, since the 19th century, has served as an almost self-evident ground for our thought. This fact is no doubt decisive in the manner of the status to be accorded to the human sciences, to the body of knowledge, though even that word is perhaps a little too strong, let us say to be more neutral still, to the body of discourse, that takes as its object man as an empirical entity, unquote. Of this historical a priori, which Foucault claims to have been the self-evident ground for our thought, he had written earlier in the same book, quote, I am concerned, in short, with a history of resemblance. On what conditions was classical thought able to reflect relations of similarity or equivalence between things? Relations that would provide a foundation and a justification for their words, their classifications, their systems of exchange. What historical a priori provided the starting point from which it was possible to define the great checkerboard of distinct identities established against a confused, undefined, faceless, and, as it were, indifferent background of differences, unquote. And again, quote, there were doubtless in this region we now term life many inquiries other than attempts at classifications, many kinds of analysis other than that of identities and differences. But they all rested upon a sort of historical a priori, which authorized them in their dispersion and in their singular and divergent projects, and rendered equally possible all the differences of opinion of which they were the source, unquote. Excuse me. Foucault is rejecting an essence of man. Again, we can see his rejection of Platonic forms in favor of an historical a priori. In fact, Foucault goes so far in his opposition to the essence of man that in the famous conclusion of The Order of Things, Foucault wrote, quote, as the archaeology of our thought easily shows, man is an invention of recent date and one perhaps nearing its end, unquote. Of course, he doesn't mean the species to which we belong, Homo sapiens, is going to go extinct. What he means is that man, as constituted by the anthropology of the classical age, and still hanging on, despite our sense having passed out of the classical age, is being dissolved by the dissolution of the epistèmé that brought man into being. This is what I called, in relation to Eric Kahler, a substantive thesis in speculative philosophy of history. And despite the radical differences between Kahler and Foucault, their substantive claims aren't really all that different. Kahler argued that we're passing out of the period of history dominated by the individual into a time when history is dominated by groups, and the problem that faces us is whether these groups will be communities defined in terms of common origin or collectives defined in terms of common aims. To the extent that we identify what Kahler called the individual with what Foucault calls man, their substantive theses overlap. In any case, Foucault further elaborates his argument, quote, among all the mutations that have affected the knowledge of things and their order, the knowledge of identities, differences, characters, equivalences, words, only one, that which began a century and a half ago and is now perhaps drawing to a close, has made it possible for the figure of man to appear. And that appearance was not the liberation of an old anxiety, the transition into luminous consciousness of an age-old concern, the entry into objectivity of something that had long remained trapped within beliefs and philosophies. It was the effect of a change in the fundamental arrangements of knowledge. If those arrangements were to disappear as they appeared, if some event of which we can at the moment do more than no more than sense the possibility, without knowing either what its form will be or what it promises, were to cause them to crumble, as the ground of classical thought did at the end of the 18th century, then one can certainly wager that man would be erased, like a face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea. Unquote. The image of a face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea is beautifully poetic, but it would be easy to see this as just another in a long, familiar list of claims that something or other is coming to an end. The end of history, the end of philosophy, the end of metaphysics, and all the other ends proclaimed in recent thought. Here's where Geertz's claim that Foucault was an anti-humanist human scientist really begins to cut, because we can at this point ask an awkward question. Is this a philosophical anthropology? Can the denial of man and the denial of anthropology be at the same time an anthropology? I've talked about philosophical anthropology in Max Scheler and yesterday in regard to Eric Kahler. But given Foucault's critique of anthropology and his critique of the human sciences, it's kind of paradoxical to assert the denial of man or the claim of the coming end of man, but it's nevertheless a claim about man and the history of man anyway. In this sense, Foucault had a speculative philosophy of history. I don't know of anyone who's called Foucault a philosopher of history, but in his book, Sartre, Foucault, and Historical Reason, Volume 2, A Post-Structuralist Mapping of History, Thomas R. Flynn does say that Foucault had a theory of history, and there's no clear demarcation between a philosophy of history and a theory of history. Specifically, Flynn attributes what he calls axial history to Foucault, and of this he writes, quote, attention to the subject has been displaced from individual to self along the axis of subjectivization. In other words, an axial reading is not static. It allows for the movement among the concepts on its line of sight, unquote. I'm not going to try to elucidate this comment, so I'm only quoting it as an exhibit, you could say. More interestingly, I think, Flynn characterized Foucault's later thought as parrhesia, which is a Greek term that has been translated as candid speech. Writing of Foucault's last course at the Collège de France in 1984, Flynn writes, quote, the topic for this term's lectures was the same as the previous year, namely the practice of plain speaking or truth-telling in the ancient Greek and Roman worlds, and there is considerable overlap between the sets. But whereas his earlier treatment had focused on parrhesia as a political virtue, you told the prince the truth even if it cost you your head, his subject this semester was truth-telling as a moral virtue. You admitted the truth even if it cost you your self-image, unquote. And then he quotes Foucault as saying that there is, quote, transformation from parrhesia and its displacement from the institutional horizon of democracy to the horizon of individual practice of ethos formation, unquote. This is the familiar idea of speaking truth to power. On the one hand, it's a remarkable claim to make in light of the opacity of Foucault's earlier works, but only if we equate truth-telling with plain speaking, which doesn't necessarily follow. On the other hand, I think you can say that this attitude is present throughout all of Foucault's works. Foucault was speaking the truth as he saw it, even if it isn't quite recognizable as such to many of us. For all that Foucault presents his historical project of genealogy as distinct from, if not antithetical to, traditional history, we can see, at least in Flynn's interpretation of Foucault, the appearance of a novel kind of moralizing history. The moralizing of traditional history was to teach ancient history as a source of moral lessons, both for the individual and for the statesman acting on behalf of some social whole. There are two facets to traditional moralizing history, and these are the praise of moral exemplars, which Nietzsche had called monumental history, and the condemnation of moral corruption, which Nietzsche had called critical history. Mindful that Foucault was building on Nietzsche in his genealogies, following and also in some ways surpassing Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals, it becomes obvious that both Nietzsche and Foucault wanted to have it both ways. They wanted to condemn traditional moralizing histories, but they also wanted to institute their own moralizing history in place of traditional moralizing. Nietzsche more or less openly admitted as much in calling for a revaluation of all values. A revaluation of values could consistently and without blushing condemn the moralizing of traditional history while calling for a moralizing history based on the values derived from his revaluation of all values. In Nietzsche, this newly moralizing history is called to serve life, and Nietzsche makes that fully explicit. It's not clear to me what history is to serve in Foucault, perhaps a radically emancipatory political program. So, whereas I began saying that I wasn't going to talk about Foucault's politics, I end up coming around to that in the end anyway. What I find interesting, excuse me, what I find interesting in this is how it turns out time and again in philosophy that those who seem to be the most radical and disruptive thinkers, like Nietzsche and Foucault, who insist upon discontinuity with the past, whether they're prophesying the end of history or the end of man, turn out to be overall rather conventional in the end. The emancipatory ideal that Foucault seems to be serving had been developing in French historical thought at least since Jules Michelet, and of course, Michelet didn't appear in a vacuum. He was channeling the revolutionary fervor of 1789 under the changed conditions of 19th century France, all the while drawing upon Giambattista Vico, who is today typically accounted a kind of reactionary. If Michelet carried on the revolution in the 19th century, Foucault carried on the revolution in the 20th century. So, happy birthday, Michel Foucault, and thanks for listening.